Alright YouTube, so we are back of course to talk about some Final Fantasy VII Remake. So we are revisiting the topic of Remake Part 2 and open world, or just in general the topic of open world when it comes to Remake. And I was a bit hesitant at first on doing another video on this. It was suggested in the comments of the last video, but I felt like we'd done a video talking about this somewhat recently, but looking here on the channel, we haven't talked about Remake and open world in like 8 months at this point. That's been a long time. That's been since before I even moved. I moved to where I live at now in September, and that video was before then. So unless it was in a different video where maybe I just trailed off from the topic, as I tend to do, I can't see us recently having talked about this, but I did want to approach it in a bit of a different way, talk about it from a different perspective today. Plus opinions change, right? That video was close to a year ago, and I believe at the end of the video, because I did watch it earlier today, that I mentioned how I feel like it needs to be open world when it comes to part 2, and I don't necessarily feel that way as of right now anyways. So first and foremost, the people that are wanting or expecting Part 2 to be open world is really just based off the fact that the original game and older Final Fantasies in general had an overworld to explore. You got to walk around on the planet, right? But the original FF7 was an open world, right? Because that's not what an open world game is. An open world game, by definition, is a game that allows you to explore and approach objectives freely without having to be forced to play the main story, which, of course, the original FF7 was not that. You pretty much had to play the story almost the whole time, right? Like, yeah, let's say your next main story objective is in Junon. You don't have to walk into the town of Junon, right? You can completely ignore. You can walk in the opposite direction back towards Midgar, back to the Mithril Mines. But what's there really to do? There's nothing, right? Eventually you're going to have to progress the main story. And with an open world game, by design would allow you to do a bunch of other side questing and exploring the world, and you could eventually come back to the main story when you're like max level. Think of like an Elder Scrolls or a Fallout game, right? Like, as soon as you get past the intro sequence of those games and you have control of your character and you're on the world map, your objective might be to the west, but you could just walk north, you could walk south, you could walk east, and you don't even have to touch that main story until you are max level. Like, that's the freedom of an open world game. And FF7 is not like that, and neither will Remake be, because Remake is not going to allow you to do that, because you're going to have to progress the story at certain points. It is an RPG, but it's still a very narrative-driven game, right? And even with Remake Part 1, as linear as the game was, you still were prevented from even exploring what little bit of exploring there is to do in that game, right? If you tried to, like, walk away from a character talking to you, or you're supposed to be walking in a certain direction, the game would literally force you to turn around and walk towards the objective. And that's with a very, very linear game, so even if there was some sort of exploration or open world aspect to Part 2, you're probably still going to be forced to do a lot of stuff at a lot of times. And look, I do hope it's different when it comes to Part 2. We're just basing this off of Part 1, and even Episode Intermission had this. For the brief 2 chapters that you have of that, DLC, you're still forced to walk forward a lot of times, where you can't walk away from some dialogue or explore. And look, there's nothing wrong with the linear game. Some of my favorite games are pretty linear, but I remember when I was playing through Remake for the first time back in 2020, every time we got to a new section, a new sector, a new area, I wanted to explore, and like most of the time you couldn't. You had to wait till certain moments of the game or story where you actually had some level of freedom and you could explore, and that was just super annoying to me. But on back to the original FF7 and the topic of like freedom, you really don't have any up until the Highwind, right? Because the Tiny Bronco lets you explore a good portion of the world, but you can only go around in shallow waters, right? And then once you get the submarine, that allows you to go into the deep parts of the ocean, but you can't just pull the submarine up to any piece of land and hop out of it, right? You have to take the submarine to certain locations to where your characters can get out of it. It's not really until you get the Highwind that you actually have the freedom to explore the world, and only then can you really maybe consider the game open world at that point. But let's talk about Remake Part 2 and the possibility of an open world. The thing is, man, when it comes to open world games, their biggest issue is having something to do, or having too much to do. In the case of something like a Ubisoft Assassin's Creed style game, there's almost always too much to do, right? Every 5 feet there's an objective or a collectible or whatever the case. You need some sort of nice balance, right? You need enough things to do so it's interesting and not a boring world like, let's say, Final Fantasy XV. Look, this was a Final Fantasy game that I was so much looking forward to, but it wasn't really on my radar until like a few months before it came out. I just wasn't really paying attention to it, didn't really care too much about it, and then I heard that it was going to be an open world Final Fantasy game, and I'm all ears, right? Because I love open world games. And then it turned out to be not really that good, right? It's a relatively boring world. There's just not a whole lot to do. Look, if you're a fan of this game, that's fine. Put aside like the characters, the story, whatever you might like about the game. The world itself is boring as an open world game. There's just nothing to do. You can walk for minutes at a time, and all you really find is creatures to fight. You might find a shiny object on the ground, or something like that, right? Or maybe those little, like, elements that you can absorb, whatever the case. But there's nothing to do in the world. It's just a very, very boring open world, and that's not what you want. So if they want to go the route of some sort of open world when it comes to Remake Part 2, we have to do better than Final Fantasy 15, right? Even if it's just boring, radiant side quest, or like miscellaneous, go get this item over here, or go kill this monster over there. I'm not advocating for those specific quests, But I'd rather have that than empty space and nothingness, right? I'd rather have something to do than nothing to do. And I know that might be a bit of a controversial opinion, and I'm fine with that, but if you really think about the side quests in base game remake, that's essentially what they were. Go get this item for this person, go get the cats, go get the chocobos, or go kill the monster. They were pretty basic and weren't that interesting, but I was fine with them. For me personally, Red Dead Redemption 2 strikes the perfect balance between a video game world and kind of a realistic world, because you can ride around for several minutes at a time and not come across anything or anybody, and then at times you can run into people that need help, right? You can be out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the woods somewhere, and you come across some random NPC that might need help because they're stuck in a bear trap, or they got bit by a snake, or they're faking like they're injured or needing help, and they're trying to rob you or kill you. I know it's a bit of an extreme example because it's a Rockstar game, it's a Rockstar open world game. Obviously, RDR2 is one of the best open worlds we've had in gaming so far, but it is a game I've been playing recently, so it's kind of in my mind. And this is just, for me, the perfect balance, because even if there's nothing to do around you, there's almost always animals to hunt, or, plants to harvest, or maybe if there's water nearby, you can go fishing. There's just almost always something to do if you want to. I don't expect a Final Fantasy game to be on par with like a Rockstar open world game, though I'd fucking love that. But still, that's what we need. We need a perfect balance. If they're going to go the route of making explorable maps that are decent size or even open world maps, you've got to have shit to do. And on the topic of that, dude, like, they almost can't even do an open world anyways, at least not a seamless open world, simply because with like the Eastern Continent, for example, which is where Midgar is and Junon is, it's divided by the Mithril Mines, of course. And unless they make a seamless world where you can walk up to the Mithril Mines and you walk into it, there's no load screen, you can explore the Mithril Mines and walk out the other side, then it's going to have to be zones, right? It's going to have to be load screens between zones. Even with something like the Western Continent, which is of course where Costa del Sol is, it's divided by Mount Corel and even the river that kind of runs through almost the middle of the continent. And once we get to here, you got to traverse through the mountains to get to North Corel and then take the gondola to, of course, Gold Saucer. And if it's anything like the original game, we're going to have to get a particular vehicle to get across this river. So it won't be a seamless open world even if there is some sort of exploration to it or an open world aspect to it. So just by the design of Gaia, unless they completely overhaul it and change it for Remake Part 2, which is of course entirely possible, we're going to have to play it how Square Enix wants us to play it, at least at certain points during certain locations around the world. And I think the best option here is something we talked about plenty of times here on the channel, is just having big zones to explore. So for starters, once you walk outside of Midgar, from like Midgar to like the Mithril Mine, is actually two different locations. Midgar, the Midgar Wasteland, and Calm are actually the Midgar area, and then the Chocobo Farm, the marshes, and the Mithril Mine are actually part of the Grasslands area. So just by using the original game as an example, there's already two different zones right there. So there could be a load screen between those and make those two just decent sized maps, or you could combine them, right? You could have from Midgar all the way to the Mithril Mine, just one giant map to explore. Either way. And of course, there'd be a load screen going to like the Mithril Mine. It'd presumably be a giant cave compared to the original game, and then maybe have its own dedicated chapter. That's something we talk about a lot. We have no idea how they're going to handle Part 2, but you can even cram some locations together. So maybe like the marshes outside the Mithril Mine, but also the Mithril Mine are all one chapter. One of my favorite examples when talking about this is Final Fantasy XII, which I know is a hit or miss game for a lot of people, and you can, again, similar to the Final Fantasy 15 thing earlier, you can put aside the story, the characters, the combat, whatever you don't like about the game. I personally love the world, because it is zone related, right? You walk into a new area, there's oftentimes multiple zones, sometimes upwards of like 10 different zones that are separated by a load screen, but the whole world's connected, right? You can start in Rabanastre, which is the first town that you start in at the beginning of the game, and you can travel to just about every single location in the world. There are a few locations where you need the airship to fly to, but for the most part, you can walk from the beginning of the game to the end almost. And I understand why people don't like the game, but me personally, I think it is an underrated Final Fantasy. But it might be my favorite world, at least so far when it comes to the Final Fantasy series, just because of how thought out and connected it is. Again, you do need the airship at certain points, but it's not like other Final Fantasy games where you eventually need a car and a boat and then the airship. Now, there's differences between 12 and 7, because obviously 7 is an entire planet, whereas 12 was mostly like one continent, I believe, one country, something like that. That's why you didn't really need a boat or anything. But still, if they went the route of something like a 12, I'd be fine with it. Obviously, bigger areas, because 12 was a PS2 game. The areas aren't really all that big. So here towards the end of the video, we got to ask the question, of course, does Remake Part 2 need to be open world? No. And just by the design of the planet of Gaia itself and the way the continents are laid out, it kind of can be. It'd be interesting. It's not impossible for them to make a seamless world where you don't have to go through load screens. And to be honest, after playing Integrate and Episode Intermission, like the load screens that exist with that, they're almost not there, right? They're so fast. Like you're talking about like half a second to a second. So even if there are load screens with Remake Part 2, assuming that they're as fast as, Integrate and Intermission, you wouldn't even really notice them, so they wouldn't even matter too much anyways. The other thing, too, to kind of close out my thoughts here on the video, is if they want to make these big zones to explore, these pseudo-open world areas, they're probably going to have to add to the world, because from Midgar to the Mithril Mine is only like 3 or 4 locations, right? And that's it. And that's not realistic if we're talking about the size of an actual planet. So there might be adding in like small towns and other areas to explore, other buildings, caves, something like that. I don't know. Which I'm perfectly fine with, because if there's little towns and villages along the way that did not exist in the original FF7 that have their own stories and side quests, that means sweet, sweet, brand new lore, and I'm all for that. My dudes, if you happen to make it this far, I appreciate any support on this video. It's a little more complicated than our standard videos. We're not just capturing 5 or 10 minute gameplay and just talking. We're actually capturing gameplay from several different video games, from several different consoles. We actually captured gameplay from a PS4, Xbox One, and PS5. I actually had to dig the Xbox One out of storage, because I used it in a long time. So, more than usual with this particular video, the likes, the comments, the subscribes if you're new, the shares if you share the videos, those are very, very much appreciated. But of course I want to pass up to you guys when it comes to this topic, open world. With this video, we try to go in more than we have in the past. We try to go harder with the topic to make it more of like a definitive discussion where I don't really need to do this topic anymore, hopefully in the future. Also, shout out to Mega3000 from the last video for kind of sparking this video idea. But my dudes, that is going to be the video. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys aren't. We'll sit down with more Final Fantasy VII Remake content. Turn on notifications. Follow me on Twitter, dashingdavidYT, and my Discord. The links to most social networks are in the description and in the outro. Later, guys.
I don't want to die! Help!
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like low gain or leave it like Cobain.